Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bikes on Amtrak, a new roadmap from the Amtrak Bike Task Force. So some quick reminders before we begin. The webinar is being recorded. It can be found later at bikeleague.org/webinars and also at our YouTube account. Closed captions are available using the show captions or hide captions buttons on the Zoom menu. And a quick reminder that all attendees are muted, but you can type questions into the Zoom chat at any time. A quick background about the League before we begin. The League was founded in 1880, making it one of the oldest advocacy organizations in the country. Our mission is to create a bicycle-friendly America for everyone, and we believe that we can improve lives and strengthen communities through bicycling. So just a brief run of schedule. We'll have a quick introduction, introducing the task force, speakers, and previewing the report. Then Noel will run through recommendations for Amtrak that were in the report. Reagan will discuss recommendations for other stakeholders, and then we'll have a call to action, discuss how to get involved with the task force and how to use the report locally, and then we'll end with a moderated Q&A. So a little bit about the Amtrak Bike Task Force. It's a nationwide coalition of stakeholders with representatives from a range of bike and tourism-related organizations, in addition to members of Amtrak's external and regulatory affairs team. And since 2022, it's been organized by the League of American Bicyclists, and we have groups from national to statewide and local orgs. These include the Adventure Cycling Association, Rails to Trails Conservancy, Bikepacking Routes, East Coast Greenway, and then we have state organizations such as Palmetto Walk Bike, Mass Bike, and then local groups such as Bike Albuquerque and out of New Mexico. So today's speakers will be Noel Battelle, Executive Director of Bikepacking Routes. We have Reagan Freeman with Palmetto Walk Bike, and I'm Will with the League of American Bicyclists, where I am the Federal Policy Fellow. So before we get into the report, just wanted to highlight some past task force work. In March 2024, the task force sent a letter to then Amtrak CEO Stephen Gardner, and this was really understanding that the Airo train investment was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to improve Amtrak service for those bringing bikes on board. So in the letter, recommendations included ensuring more and better bike storage with Airo trains and making it easier to travel by bike by allowing for wider tire clearance on the racks and not requiring front wheel removal. So then later that year, May 2024, we got a response from CEO Gardner, and he discussed how the Airo coach cars will each have one baggage/bike tower that's capable of holding two bikes when used for bike transport. And additionally, some of the Airo train sets will have a baggage compartment, which will have additional storage space for bike storage, either self-service or checked baggage. And then there will also be improved racks that are capable of holding bikes with tires up to 3 inches wide, versus the 2 inches max previously, which will be helpful for gravel and mountain bikes. So here we have a little preview of what the racks on the Airo trains will look like, courtesy of Mariah Morales with Amtrak. So you can see the two racks here, the two spaces on that single rack here, and this has 3 inches max of tire clearance, and there's no need, crucially, to remove the front wheel, as is the case on some legacy rolling stock. So a little background on the report. So the task force was inspired by two European Cyclist Federations report, 2021 and 22 Cyclists Love Trains, as you can see in the right side of the screen. And the task force was interested in finding a way to apply the 2025 ECF framework to the US context. So in September of last year, the League and the task force began work on adapting the ECF criteria to Amtrak. So the changes made are all detailed in the forthcoming report, but just to highlight a few, we removed the bicycle sharing schemes that ECF had, as well as the language indicator, due to the fact that the US is not the same multilingual landscape as the European Union, and the US does not have the similar rail-operated bicycle sharing schemes that Europe does. So we adapted it so that it's 50 points hardware, 40 software, and we added station staffing as a proxy for bike access, and we added reservation requirements. And then once this criteria was adapted, we ranked 46 Amtrak lines on bicycle inclusiveness. However, the focus was not entirely on the bike inclusivity scores. There's a section with recommendations for a wide range of stakeholders, including Amtrak and other parties, such as station and platform owners, advocacy organizations, and other interested individuals, which we'll get to now with Noel.
Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. I'm Noelle Battle, the Executive Director of Bikepacking Routes. We're a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to growing the bikepacking community, lowering barriers, and advocating for facilitating the bikepacking experience. So, been a part of this Amtrak Bike Task Force for a few years now, as we see this as a really great way to be involved with continuing making it better and easier to travel by using Amtrak and for your bike adventures. I'm going to go through just a few recommendations that we have. I think as part of the task force, created related to this report, we're always thinking about what are, incremental improvements that we can make. A lot of this is long-term advocacy. You see, we had some good wins, as Will pointed out, with improvements coming in the longer trains. But a lot of this is pretty complex in terms of what can logistically be done within the systems and the infrastructure that Amtrak has. But we've laid out a few of our top priorities that we're sharing with Amtrak coming along with the publishing of this report and a next letter that we'll be writing to them. So the first one is related to the website experience and booking tickets and having the information that's needed for whether bike service is available. I'll go a little bit into detail of each of these recommendations shortly. The second is prioritizing. There are a lot of Amtrak stations around the country that are near very popular bike routes or other bike destinations, but there is no bike surface, mostly because those stations are unstaffed. But there is precedent for changing that, so we are prioritizing that as another recommendation. And then finally, wanting to simplify the bike fee payment structure. Sometimes there's multiple payments needed, and we have a suggestion with a bundled rail pass as well. So next slide. So just to mention, if folks aren't very familiar with the resources that are out there, I think Amtrak has done a great job. There are some really good resources online that you might not know about. If you just Google Amtrak bike, there's a page about bringing your bicycle on board, and a lot of this has grown. Roll-on bike service has only been available since 2015. So, we're making gradual improvements, but there are some key pages on the Amtrak website that do have a lot of information, FAQs. They lay out the different types of service. That's one of the complications is things can be different depending on what route, what station, what train set is being used. So that does complicate things a lot. But this tries to lay out the different types of train service, what lines there are being used, and other information that you might need about taking your bike on board. So that's the first step if you aren't familiar with that yet. Next slide. And this just shows, so in detail on that page, these are looking at the drop downs of carry-on bicycle service or train sides checked bicycle service. So you can see how it's detailing which train lines have the various types of service. One of the key challenges, if you look on the right side for this train side checked bicycle service, almost every line there says it's available at select stations. So it's not consistent of whether it's going to be available on any given line for each station. And it doesn't go down to that granular level of detail here. Next slide. There are a couple of other improvements that have been made. So, you are able to, when you're going to book a ticket and you're looking on a specific route, you can filter by whether they have bike service. You can drop down on each of these options that would come up for you and see if there's bicycle service there. And then when you check out, there's usually almost always an extra fee. It's usually $20 per segment of the trip for adding your bicycle. And it'll show you how many spaces are left because there's capacity since this is bike racks, especially for the roll-on service. They can only accommodate a certain number of bicycles. So sometimes it might be available on a given train, but it's already sold out. Next slide. So generally our recommendation for this, I think they are a lot of great resources out there, but one of the key things that we struggled with the task force and this report and trying to get even clarify the data of whether stations have bike service or not to be able to score the lines. You kind of have to really dig in. My go-to method is to go to a given line and look at their list of stations, and then you can click on each individual station and see if it has checked bag service, and that is usually a good proxy of whether it has bike service, but not always. So there's a little bit of like, you can get the information. It might not be 100% correct because there's exceptions to the rule and you have to dig around a little bit. So we're recommending having just an easier access way to be able to determine exactly what the status is of bike service on at a given station, and fix some of those inconsistencies and other things around that. Next slide. So the second recommendation is station expansion, as we mentioned, prioritizing. So really this, I think, comes in line with the train side checked bicycle service, which is the case for most long distance trains, I believe. And outside of, I live on the East Coast, so Northeast Corridor has a lot of roll-on service, but any of the trains across the country would have checked bicycle service. So there are many unstaffed stations that don't offer bicycle service. And many of these stations, as I mentioned, are near very important places for bicycle tourism. So it would be really a game changer if people could take their bikes to these destinations. So we'd like to prioritize more of this. Next slide. So some of the problems why they can't just offer bicycle service is the bikes are stored in baggage cars. They usually require Amtrak staff to load the bikes into a baggage car. And then often the platform height or length determines whether that's possible. It might be too high to be able to lift bikes onto up to the cars, or the platform might not be long enough that both the passenger car and the baggage car could be accessed from the platform. And as we might talk about later in this report, there's limitations because Amtrak doesn't own many of these station platforms. So sometimes it's out of Amtrak's control or not completely, whether changes can be made here. Next slide. So there is precedent for this, which is great. On Amtrak's website in the FAQs, it says they're continuously auditing unstaffed stations where they can safely and efficiently offer train-side checked bicycle service. And this is a list of some of the stations across the country where they have added that service. I haven't yet, but I'd love to do a deep dive more into kind of the case studies around these. Next slide. And so we've recommended, through folks on the task force, some of the key stations that could utilize additional to have bike service. One that Reagan's going to talk about later in the presentation is Anniston, Alabama. That's actually a case study around that where the community is really doing the work to make this happen, to lengthen the platform, because that's a really great gateway for a 100-mile paved trail system going from Atlanta out to Anniston. Bikepacking Routes is created a very large route network out in the Mon Forest in West Virginia. There's also a great river trail out there, and we'd love to see access expanded there, similar to what was done in Prince, West Virginia. And we know it's very popular for people to take the trains to access routes such as the Gap and the C&O. So this would be a huge benefit. And then Greenville, South Carolina, as well as another recommendation. There's a great access to a trail there. Amtrak even mentions the trail in some of their publications, but there isn't actually bike service at that station. Next slide. And then the last recommendation we have is, simplifying bike payment fees. And, essentially it is an extra cost every time you want to bring a bike on your ride. Typically $20. Sometimes it's state subsidized, so it might be less. But if you have to change trains or have multiple legs of a journey, then that often adds up. So it could be quite expensive, end up paying just as much or more for your bike than for your own ticket. So that could be a barrier for some, for sure. So we'd like to look into ways to just streamline that process. And one thing that we're doing is thinking about a proposal for a bundled rail pass. Next slide. So that there is a USA Rail Pass that gives the opportunity for 10 segments over 30 days that you can purchase at a single price. We'd love to see if there's a possibility to build in the cost of bike travel, upfront into that ticket cost and reduce some of the burden of making bike reservations for every trip along that way. I think, again, there's challenges with the reservation system being and bike space being subject to availability, but that is a thing we'd like to, all of these I think are long-term advocacy areas and things that we want to keep pushing just to continue making. So happy to answer any questions, but I'll hand it over to Reagan now.
Thanks, Noel, and thank you, folks. Good to be with you. This is Reagan Freeman from Palmetto Walk Bike here in rainy Columbia, South Carolina. We're the statewide advocacy group here. I think we can all agree South Carolina is really the hub of major rail activity, so it makes a lot of sense for me to be on this call. But I'll tell you, our perspective is, beyond me just selfishly loving trains and thinking they're pretty cool and it's fun to take your bike on the train. I think everyone can agree this is an incredible opportunity to really leverage, I think, a lot of energy and momentum around trying to make our entire nation more multimodal, right? So that really comes down to how can we best support a bunch of different travel options for different people. And that's kind of how we got involved here. I've also done a couple of bike tours using Amtrak, and it's very cool. So kind of my thing I'm going to touch on is really beyond the asks we're making of Amtrak. I think there's a lot of opportunity that we can do all together. Really, I think there's really big potential. And the report really details this about how do you kind of get to the point where people want to do this and how do we increase that kind of bike rail access. Next slide here. So, I mean, it really comes down to this, y'all. Bike and rail is a shared effort for us all. And we've kind of identified a couple of core groups, station owners, communities who are interested, businesses who, that can be if you're a tourism business or someone who kind of has a vested interest in seeing more rail and bike travel. And of course, advocates and of course, folks who like riding Amtrak with a bike. Next slide, please. So this is very important, and I'm sure some people on this call know this, but why is this collaborative? And it's very simple. Amtrak only owns a very small percentage of the stations, platforms, and parking facilities that they put through and use on their services, right? I believe 97% of route miles operate on tracks owned by other people, and I think we can understand it's inherently going to be collaborative to try and get any kind of progress done. However, I think we can all agree that partnerships and collaboration really do build and build and build. And we've had a lot of success with that here in South Carolina, and I'm sure across the country as well. So next slide, please. So launching in station and platform owners, the report tries to talk about the actual station experience. If boarding a train with a bike feels stressful or confusing, people are less likely to try it. We've highlighted a couple of things that I think make a lot of sense. Safe station access for bikes. And by that, I mean, it needs to be safe to be able to get to the station via a bicycle, right? Like if it's not safe to get there, you're not really going to have that bike travel. Another piece we've identified is secure bike parking, both short-term and long-term, depending. I think for this bike and rail piece, I think it makes more sense to focus on where do you store your bike while you're waiting on your train. Visible wayfinding to get to the station. easier boarding for bikes, and that can be a lot of things. It can be maybe additional time to be able to load your bike on the train. Longer term, maybe a larger project, of course, is platform length or even the raised versus a level platform to be able to get your bike on the train. The photo here is more of a level system. Here in Columbia, I have to pick my bike up. I got 5 feet to hand it to the conductor in the baggage car, the Floridian. So it does vary. Something we've also called out is there's really a great opportunity to integrate bike share in communities that have that service into the station and try to generate trips that way. And we'll touch on that in Davis, California as a case study. But also, and I think Noel touched on this a bit, unstaffed stations. How can we get more train-side checked bike service? And if you are, representing a station or a platform owner on this call, I think there's some great models. I detail Prince, West Virginia here, but I think we can see there's a few others. And I think it makes sense through this report, you'll be able to read kind of what that model is and how things can go. However, the good news is most of these improvements are, pretty small, and they can be done with some concerted effort. Next slide here. So I want to talk about Anniston, which is near and dear to my heart down here in the South. Anniston is probably one of the best examples in the report of a community recognizing opportunity before the transportation system has adapted. And that's still true today, right? So on the Amtrak side, you've got the Crescent route, right? That does run through here. It goes from, I mean, I can't actually tell you where it terminates and ends, but it does, travel from Atlanta to Charlotte, and it goes through Anniston. So there is a lot of kind of long distance travel here. But on top of this, the station itself is actually the endpoint of what is the Chief Ladiga Trail. If anyone knows what that is a 35-mile long rail trail that goes from Anniston to the Alabama state line, where it then transforms into the Silver Comet Trail, which is another 65 miles all the way to outside of Atlanta, Georgia. What's very cool is there's some friends of mine from the Path Foundation who I know with a lot of other advocates are working very, very hard to try and finally get that Silver Comet system connected to the Beltline in downtown Atlanta. So there's a future where not only is this rail trail 105 miles, I think is the number I got, but you can really get some serious connectivity going in that sense. And so for Anniston, they have all of this potential. They really plan to get their rail trail, terminating at the Amtrak station. I think they call it the multimodal station in Anniston. And local leaders really understood that this was an opportunity, but they kind of got left out when bike service was added to the Crescent Line because of the fact that their platform was not long enough. And so they actually went through and applied for several grants to lengthen their platform, which is a project that is ongoing. And so they're really hopeful to be able to get that bike service. Something else to consider is this is an unstaffed station, which is why this is a recommendation we're making to Amtrak directly, because we just think there's such an opportunity here. There's so many great models I think people know about. I know the Katy Trail, the Amtrak line that runs with that. You can essentially ride one direction and then take the train back. I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call that have done that. And it's just such an incredible thing. And so we're hopeful that Anniston is able to do that. I really want to give them credit. They've done a lot of work here to show why this matters. And I think if you look at this is an example of how leadership and partnership can kind of unlock that regional tourism potential. So you want to go to the next slide, Will? So this is amazing to me. It's a very small community in Anniston, Alabama, but it just has a tremendous, tremendous economic output. And I think a lot of that's due to their trails, right? And I think Anniston is being very strategic, and I got to give them credit. They want bikes on trains to continue to support their local economy. So keep this in mind. These numbers are before they get bike service on this train. And I think we can all imagine that as this stuff increases and as they're able to get this service and allow people to maybe ride it one way and then take the train back or make it a multi-day event, this is an incredible opportunity. And I think the story here is the train stations can become gateways to entire regions when communities plan around them. I think some of this is pretty obvious. If destinations are economically successful and Amtrak goes through town, bike access creates an opportunity to expand that visitation, and not everybody has to drive, which is just incredible. Next track here. So what can communities do? I think that's a pretty big question. I don't think many of us own a train station, but if you do, let me know in the chat here. One thing that I loved about the report, and I'm so thankful to the task force for trying to make it actionable, is many of these recommendations are actually pretty achievable. So sometimes communities can start making their communities more bike friendly and their stations more bike friendly by trying to support safer station access. So that can mean low stress routes to stations, making sure the stations are perhaps long term strategically. There's at least links to trails and downtown areas. We've already touched on bike parking. Something we'll touch on from here in Columbia is wayfinding to stations, which is a pretty easy lift. And of course, including these stations in bike and safety plans. So these transportation plans, if we know, for example, the station is out in the sticks, it's been relocated, and there's not a really safe ability to get there on a bike, at least making that a priority in these long range decisions to ensure that over time, this can be something that can be improved to encourage that kind of travel. And then as always, becoming a bicycle friendly community. I think the league does an incredible service, and that really has a great framework because it gives the structure and momentum for this work. And I don't want to speak for my friends in the league here, but I'm sure they'd be willing to help you out as much as they can. Next track here. So this is very cool. I want to drop a link in the chat. This to our right is a wonderful PDF of something that the Amtrak Cascades offers, which is a great little brochure that they have about taking your bike on that train. And I think this is a great example of what businesses, economic development, tourism groups, and the lot can do to try to support this bike travel. So beyond the normal kind of, yes, thank you for getting into the real chat. Beyond the normal kind of advocacy for all ages and abilities bike infrastructure, which makes so much sense, you have this opportunity for trail and rail tourism. So this is an example of maybe a guide of where to go and how to ride the train on the Cascades line here. But the other piece too is, there's also opportunities to create like some kind of, let's say, local bike map for the station. Where do you want to ride? How can you park your bike? Are there trails nearby? That kind of thing. Sometimes I think including and supporting those end of trip amenities, if that's long-term bike parking or some other way to keep your bike safe, or even a repair stand nearby the station, that's an opportunity. Again, bike-friendly businesses, same thing as the communities. That's a great opportunity. And I touched on this already, kind of long-term. Is the station safe to access by bike? I think that's going to be a huge question, but it can be fixed with enough time and enough commitment to the community there. And I'm going to say bike parking again. This is just a little niche interest of mine, but having ample parking both around the station, but also around the community where people are going to travel is just so key. It is just absolutely key. So next slide here, because I want to talk about this. This is Davis, California. I see a lot of West Coast here in the chat. And Will, please chime in. I think you delved into this more than I did, but my understanding is this case study focuses kind of on a different challenge, right? The first and last mile problem, which is why I think I'm talking about, bike parking so much. So if the train itself works well, people still need a way to complete their trips after arriving. So Davis partnered with Spin and the Capital Corridor line to integrate bike share directly into rail access. Riders, you can actually access free station bike share if you buy a rail ticket. Do I have that right, Will? Am I correct about that?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, it's really an incredible pilot, and the report profiles this because getting that friction eliminated is just one of the biggest ways to try and increase ridership. And if somebody can step off the train and immediately continue their trip without needing to, get in a car, rail becomes dramatically more useful. And I think the broader story here is about integration, reducing friction, that kind of thing. And I think we can all agree bikes, bike share, trains, transit, and walking all function as a larger transportation network. And so our report kind of profiles this as a potential model for other systems nationally. That's something to consider. Next track here. Yes. All right. So this is home. This is a small little niche project of mine, and I got to call it out. Um, I love where I'm from. Anyone who doesn't know Columbia, it's the state capital. We have an intact street grid for anyone who's interested, but the benefit of that is there's a lot of bikeability, and our community's begun to invest in trying to make our city more compelling. We're building greenways, we're doing all this stuff. But something that local advocates worked with me to identify is the fact that no one knows where to go. And we actually received a small grant from a local public health group here to try and fix that by installing some bicycle wayfinding. And it was really important to me and to other local advocates that, while we do have the Floridian here, which is a long distance train, we would love to encourage ridership to try to get more people aware that it's part of our transportation network. So the idea was very simple, including Amtrak from the jump as a destination and showing it is just as easy to get there as it is to other places people normally ride. Our State House, our Main Street District, the Five Points District, those are opportunities to try to just build awareness of Amtrak. I think we paid for 50 signs with $3 grand, and we've only installed about 20 of them, and we're waiting on some more infrastructure enhancements to continue to really start building this out. But we've only gotten positive feedback. I will tell you, I've spoken to about 25 people in the last 2 weeks who did not know we had an Amtrak station, which is pretty cool. And I've had many conversations, probably ever before in my life, where people are going, you can take your bike on the train. And it's really, really, really interesting to have those conversations. And I think this shows thinking about it from the jump and making sure you can try to connect these areas. If it's a low stress route someone takes, or it's an opportunity to show that this is possible, you can also get that ridership there. And this is just tremendously, tremendously low cost. Next slide here. So the big one, what advocates and individuals can do. And I think it's very simple. Advocacy is central throughout this report. The improvements discussed happen because local people pushed for them. And that can mean a lot of things. I think something we're pushing for people to do is, of course, attend planning meetings, advocate for safer station access. We go into detail in the report about lower bike fees. I think Noel mentioned that most of the time on these longer routes, it's $20 each kind of way. It does vary if you have a state-supported route and there's additional pieces there, but it always makes sense to push for lower. I've taken a train to Raleigh from Columbia where the cost of the bike being $20 was almost, or over double the cost of my $7 ticket one way. Working with local governments to support expanded rail service. We've touched on bike-friendly designations, which is so important. And again, I got to touch on the where to ride maps for Amtrak lines seems like a layup. And I wonder if there are opportunities that we at the task force can explore, longer term to try to facilitate some of that on places where that could be done. That seems like a great way for people to get involved and show that there is interest. And I want to say here, many successful projects started with small groups of people talking about barriers and building partnerships. And so I think there's opportunities to take some of this stuff that we've shared and try to build on it. And really that kind of goes to my closing if you want to go to the next slide. Well, I think this is built together. I really do think we have a role to play. I think it does vary depending on where you are in our country to the kind of access you have to, bike and rail it. But I think there's just a lot of potential there. So yeah, please read the report, go into detail. Will did a great job. I know he'll do the closing, but it is worthwhile to see what we've written about to try to find moments to emulate and try to make our entire thing work better for bikes on trains. So
Thank you, Reagan. Yeah, so just a little bit, we know that the report is forthcoming, so just a little bit on some of the top line findings. So bicycle accessibility scoring by Amtrak line, we were really pleased to see that the top of the chart looks a bit like the European one. So the highest scoring lines we had were the Cascades at 87 and Gold Runner at 86 out of 100 points. And that nears the 88 points that the Belgian and Swiss National Railways earned in the 2025 edition of the Cyclists of Trains report. And then we also found that offering both service modes, carry-on and train-side check, was the single strongest correlate of high bicycle inclusiveness scoring in this framework. But there is a caveat that we have to mention that the 5 dual mode lines were all well-resourced state-supported corridors, and that the sustained state DOT investment and advocacy partnerships likely lifted performance across multiple indicators simultaneously, not just because of the service mode. And then we will be seeing 15 lines receiving Airo train sets starting this fall, and we're going to expect to see increases in the bike inclusivity scores on those lines. So as a quick example of that, we have the Vermonter train line. So today, the Vermonter train line scores 51 with 30 of a possible 50 points on the bicycle spaces indicator, which means they have an average of 6 bicycle spaces per train set. And then post Airo implementation, the Airo train sets are going to be running in 6-car configurations, a locomotive plus 5 passenger cars. And each Airo passenger car will have that rack with space for 2 bicycles. So that will bring the Vermonter up to a score of 50 points, the maximum hardware score, meaning they have space for 10 or more bicycles. The result of this is that Vermonter's overall score is therefore projected to increase by 20 points to 71. And this will move the line out of the moderate band and into the good band, as you can see on the right side of the screen. And for using this locally, if you have a station in your community, like Reagan said, advocate for your community to become a bicycle-friendly community. You can look at this link here for the League's bicycle-friendly community page to learn more. Also advocating for your train station or platform to become a BFB. And then Also, as mentioned, the state-supported Amtrak routes working to reduce bike ticket costs and how to disseminate better information on bicycling access, and then creating those where to ride guides for those interested in bringing their bikes on the train, which Reagan talked about the Cascades example, and the Pacific Surfliner already does this as well. And they have both of these posted on their website, so it's really available for folks that are interested. And now we'll take some time to do some questions and answers. The first question I see is about, does a folding bike in a carry bag escape the many trappings of bike service on Amtrak? And yes, the folding bikes are fully separate from this. This is about fully non-assembled, non-disassembled bikes. So the folding bikes, they are allowed on every train, even the Acela, and they just need to fit within a certain criteria that's on the bike FAQ page for size. Then we have another question about, will these slides be shared, and a link to the report. We will be sharing these slides to everyone that was registered, and once the report is released, we'll also share the link to the report there. And then we did have a question about Acela, and if the league and the task force are working with Amtrak to support bringing bikes onto Acela. We have not talked about the Acela aspect very much. The next gen trains do not have bicycle spaces for them. And from brief conversations with the Amtrak external affairs team, the Acela is really their business class platform along the Northeast corridor. So it doesn't seem like it's something that they're really willing to push for at this point in time, but it's definitely something that we're going to be continuing to monitor. And then Reagan or Noel, if you want to answer this one, is there a similar task force for transit overall for places like the Puget Sound or Bay Area, other groups that might make it so that you can enhance accessibility and make it more attractive to combine biking and transit? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thing that I'm specifically aware of in terms of coordination across those, but I'm probably not the most knowledgeable in that area. Sorry.
I don't have much either, but I think it's an incredible idea. I mean, I think we're all touching on the same point, right? Like that accessibility, trying to make it more accessible to travel between modes is just so key. And I think it's worth, keeping to kind of bang that drum. I think that does need to be considered. I don't know who those groups would be necessarily in your area, but no, it seems very important.
Just to add to that, I would suggest a good starting place could be looking at statewide bike organizations, because they typically do have some interactions with their transit counterparts. So that could be a good starting point. Then, sorry, just moving along, we see, sorry, lost my spot. So a question about consistency along the routes regarding loading and unloading bikes in terms of signage. This question says that it's usually up to individual agents to get cyclists and their bikes to and from cars in the condition they need to be in. So that is something we talk about. We do mention training for conductors in the report. So this is something that we really hope that sharing this information and making it sure so that everyone's on the same page about how to go about bringing your bike on board. Yeah, so we are addressing that in the report, and we're excited to share that with you.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that?
Mhm.
I think another thing that we have talked about doing, and there are resources out there, but again, someone needs to proactively search for it. It's just if there's other things that we can do in terms of education consistently with folks. My friend was taking the train today after a bike summit that we were at yesterday. And, I kind of have my tips and tricks from having ridden the train a lot with my bike. And this goes to the question in the chat too about like taking your bags off, sort of having a routine of like, look, look make yourself seen, look for the conductor, ask them where to go, as opposed to just getting in a car, which might not be the right car. Um, and then sort of letting them know you need help or that you know what you're doing and like you're going to need a few minutes to take your bags off. I think there's more, that we could hopefully do because it's still, I know, realize it's intimidating for people doing this for the first time. And then that creates friction between conductors, other passengers, and cyclists. So it's on our list of if there's things that we can do just educationally. And then, yeah, consistent training on the conductor side as well is important.
Perfect. And we have another question about taking off racks and baskets on the new Airo trains. This is not something that has been expressed to us from Amtrak. That's something that we will follow up on. I do know that in the past on more legacy equipment, they have had people remove pannier racks. I'm not sure about baskets specifically, but that's my understanding right now is that previously you had to remove pannier backs and saddlebags. But we will look into whether or not that's the case on the new Aero train set. We have another question about Michigan and whether or not they will see any increased bicycle access or storage capacity. And I believe that one of the 15 lines receiving Aero train sets is a Michigan service line. So I don't have the list in front of me, but if you look up Amtrak Aero, there's an Amtrak webpage that lists out all the there are 83 different train sets and it lists out all the 15 different lines that they're going to be going on. So that can
I
help you
think,
there.
can I add on to that? And
Yeah.
maybe I saw that question and it might be an interesting thing for us to just check that it sounds like they have some of the newer coaches that might have more space, but the
Mm.
reservation system actually isn't reflecting that more space. And that could be
Mm.
due to the fact that maybe there's not always more space, but that's, a glitch if it is happening, and maybe that's something that could be resolved. Because if there is more space in these new trains, then that should be reflected in the ability to reserve more bikes. But I wouldn't say that it's not possible that that's not seamlessly happening.
Absolutely. And then we have another question about a specialized bike. So can you use the train with a recumbent trike? So the only line that we ranked that does allow for non-standard bicycles is the Pacific Surfliner. It allows two-wheeled tandems. That was on the opening slide. But none of them specifically stated that they allow for recumbent tricycles. So the two-wheeled tandem on the Pacific Surfliner is all that we're aware of regarding non-standard or standard, non-standard, non-folding bicycles. And then we do have another question about, is there guidance on helping travelers prepare their bikes for the train, letting people know in more places that they need to be able to manage bags during the trip? Do either of you guys want to handle this?
There's a lot on YouTube. I know it's not official recommendations. That's a great question. Beyond the stuff on the Amtrak website, Noel, I'm not sure if you are aware of anything or.
Can you repeat the question? I was just typing something in the chat.
No problem. The question is there guidance on helping travelers prepare their bikes for the train, letting people know in more places that they need to be able to manage bags during the trip?
Yeah, I think that was sort of what I was getting at earlier is there are resources out there we've talked about. I actually wrote up a whole outline of potential videos for us to make for each train line and what they would cover, just to have something consistent and that the task force could put out, but also maybe pointing to some other videos. So I think there are resources, but there could be more education because I think folks still don't quite know exactly what to do. And so, yeah, something we're going to try to work on.
Absolutely. And then we have one more question here before we have some comments that we want to mention. Someone asked, can we join the LAB Bike Task Force group? And yes, that's actually on the final slide I have here. For those interested in getting involved, please email Karen at bikeleague.org or myself, Will at bikeleague.org. and we can go from there. Oh, sorry, wrong way. And then just some of these comments that we wanted to share. Kimberly shared that the Cascades has gotten better and better with bikes on trains. And they mentioned that now they permit folks with bikes to board with business class passengers so that you have more time to walk the baggage car and then still board before fellow coach passengers. This is amazing because this is something that we thought about including in the report. So it's great to hear that some of the lines are already doing this. So thank you for sharing that, Kimberly. And then Nora mentioned the issue of platform levels. So saying that I would like to have a map that shows where the doors are level with the platform because there's no way they think that it could lift the bike as high as some might require. So that's a really interesting thing. It's not something that we talked about in the report, but definitely something to keep in mind for a future edition. And then we had a comment from Alma about the Elroy Sparta Trail, the first rail trail in the country here in Illinois. And they offer free community showers as an end of trip amenity. So they're donation based and freezing cold, but they're a great way to encourage bikers on the trail to stop and hang around the community. So that sounds like something that definitely should be considered for these longer term, longer routes, such as the Chief-Ladiga Trail that that Reagan was mentioning. And then one more, we have a comment from Nora, talked about riding the train to Philadelphia and then using bike share. And the dock was empty when she returned at home after rush hour. So there was definitely some last mile commuting going on. So yeah, that's what we love to see. And that kind of ties into the Davis example that we shared, and that's going to be in the report, which is about the first last mile access. And it's the first in the nation program that uses a verified transit trip. So they work with the payment processor for the Davis station. And if you take a spin bike and you end it in a geo-fenced area around the station and you have a Capital Corridor ticket for that day, then they automatically waive the fee for your ride. And this is different than a lot of the other programs that are going on. There are several cities like Los Angeles has a similar program, but that requires an opt-in. So this is the most seamless and this way you're able to experience this benefit without any action on your part. And we're really excited that in the fall there's going to be a randomized controlled trial, and they're going to see whether or not offering such first last mile free bike sharing that will increase Capital Corridor usage. So if it does show this, that's something that we really think other Amtrak stations and lines should consider. And anyone has other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But for right now, oh, I see one more. Are any Amtrak stations currently designated bicycle-friendly businesses? I'm not sure. That's a question for our Bicycle Friendly America team, and I'm happy to pass that along to them and provide an answer when we send out the slides. So thank you for asking that. And we will definitely get back to you on that. So now I will, again, if you're interested in joining the task force, here are the emails to reach out to myself and Karen Whitaker, our Deputy Executive Director. And then I'm going to show the preview our next webinar, which is going to be Tuesday, June 16th at 3 p.m. Ride with Pride, celebrating LGBTQ plus bike clubs. And you can use the QR code on the left-hand side to register. And then here were the references that we used, and then as well as the image credits. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Reagan. Thank you, Noel. We really appreciate all the interest in this topic, and we can't wait to share the report with you and all the hard work that's gone into it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Perfect. Thank you.